Welcome aboard. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to talk about change and transition and hopefully how to do those things well. Whenever I'm in London and I get to ride on the London Underground, one of my favorite things is that when you reach the end of a line, they make an announcement that sounds something like this. They say, "This is Epping, where this train terminates. All change, please." Which I think is just so very polite to say, "All change, please." They're basically saying, "Get off the train," but they do it in such a nice way. And also, that is a good proverb to live by. All change, please. Everything is always going to be changing. And so we've got to learn to do change and transition well. As that old saying goes, change is the only constant in life. And that's actually a good thing because change moves stories along. And all of us are living a story individually and in a far more connected way. And change is what moves our stories along. I genuinely believe that God loves us too much to leave us where we are. Now, some change is really good and we enjoy it. Some change is not so great and we do not enjoy it. And we need to be able to learn to deal with both. Change keeps our stories going. Nobody would watch a movie or read a book where there wasn't any change. If you opened it up and it was just a static description, first of all, that wouldn't take very long. And second of all, really, what would be the point? There's no story there. Change keeps us moving, but how we deal with it is incredibly important. It speaks volumes about how we treat the world around us, how we deal with other people. The BBC had an article that explained using the example of a homeless person. And they said people who can deal with change well are actually far more likely to be generous or to get involved. And that's because in their estimation, people who do change management well understand that we are part of a story. So looking at a homeless person, they know that how they are right now as we see them is not how they've always been. They definitely came from something. There's more story behind them, but also they have more story ahead of them. And so you're more willing to interact. You're more willing to do something to help change that story. People who have good change management skills tend to be more likely to get involved, tend to be more generous. Whereas people without good change management skills tend to react just to whatever's in front of them and their initial feeling. So seeing a homeless person, they might only react to either sadness or grief or shame without being willing to go any further into story. And so how we deal with change is incredibly important. The Bible has some great examples of this. One of my favorites comes right at the beginning, and it's from Genesis. And it's the story of Abram, who became Abraham. I want to read to you from Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, and it says this. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of earth will be blessed." Those are some pretty big promises, and Abram was called to make big changes in order to make that happen. In those days, leaving your country of origin was a much bigger deal than it is now. And it's a big deal now. Now we have some universal structures around the world. Most places we go, we can at least rely on some degree of connection, some degree of internet or an electric and water, and in most places. Back in the day, though, leaving the known country to venture out into the unknown, that was a big ordeal. Abram was asked to give up a lot. He was asked to deal with a ton of change. He was promised many blessings. And Abram didn't do it perfectly, but through all of his trials, through all of his struggles, the story continues on about Abram becoming Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation. And the story tells that through all of his trials, through all of his struggles, through all of his difficulties, he kept his eye on God's promises. He had to give up a lot of stability, but the adventure continued and those blessings came true. I think the same applies to us. And one of the big things I think we need to remember in change is that it is dynamic, and whatever we're experiencing in the moment isn't going to last forever. In the story of Abraham, there are loads of trials that he dealt with. We deal with those too. To give you an example from my own life, I feel like my most embarrassing story is a phenomenal example of how sometimes it helps to be able to break change and transition down into the different steps. Because if we know that whatever we're in is just a step and there will be a next one, it helps us to keep moving forward. Sometimes the hardest part about change and transition is we feel like we're drowning in the unknown, and we worry subconsciously or consciously that maybe this is all there is, that maybe unknown is all we'll ever have. That's not actually true. So to set the stage for this very quick story, I was a teenager. I was about 15, and I was going to school in Europe. I was going to a US military school, and we used to have a gathering for military schools from countries all over Europe. We would get together for a leadership conference on the Spanish island of Ibiza, or Ibiza, depending on where you're from. And they would get about 500 teenagers together from high schools all over Europe for this retreat. And it was a ton of fun. And this is where I want to introduce the very first step that usually happens in change. The very first step, the first part that we're in, is usually some degree of adventure. Sometimes it's adventure with excitement. Sometimes it's adventure of just the unknown. But most change begins with just that, adventure or unknown. And so going to this trip was all kinds of adventure. There were lots of unknowns when I liked the people there, but I was still energized a bit. Sometimes it's a good energizing. I was excited to meet the people. Sometimes it's just adrenaline because we're worried about what's going to happen. But that first step is some degree of adventure. For me, it ended up being a very positive adventure. I was around, 500 other teenagers. It was great fun. It was a great trip. It was a great retreat. I made loads of friends. And in the evenings, we were able to go out onto the beach where there were loads of bonfires and people would play guitar. That's exciting. I don't play guitar. I have no musical talent whatsoever, but they were fun to be around. Now, about midway through the week, I became really tired. I'd been staying up late, getting up early. By about Wednesday or Thursday of the week, my body was like, no, we need to sleep now. And I said, fine. So late one night on the beach, I said goodnight to everybody. I began the long trek back up to the hotel. And I say long trek because it was. To get from the beach to the mainland, you had to go up stairs carved out of a cliff. Then you had to climb up a hill to get to the hotel entrance. And then I was on the 5th floor and there were only stairs. And so I did. I trekked up the steps in the cliff. I trekked up the hill to the hotel. I nearly just took a nap in the lobby and I thought, no, I will keep on going. So I trekked up the stairs. Now I tracked to the 1st floor, to the 2nd floor, to the 3rd floor, to the 4th floor, and here's where the problems began. Because my legs on the 4th floor decided, that's enough, we must be home. Home was on the 5th floor, and rather than being like a normal person and using my eyes to look at room numbers, I trusted my legs, who said, we've climbed far enough. So I walked to the end of the hallway on the 4th floor, not the 5th floor, and opened the door that I thought was to my room. It was not. Nobody was inside, and I was about to hop into bed, not knowing that it wouldn't even have been my bed. But I'd been out on the beach covered in sand. You gotta wash that off. So I threw myself in the shower, and alarm bells began to go off. Here's where we introduce the next section of transition. It usually starts with adventure in the unknown. At some point, though, by the very nature of change and transition, there's going to be crisis. Sometimes it's a little crisis. Sometimes we just don't know what to say. Sometimes it's big crisis. I didn't even realize what level of crisis I was in at this point. In the shower, the crisis began because I couldn't find any of my stuff. I couldn't find my towel or my shampoo. I did have hair at the time. Couldn't find my body wash, nothing. And so that's a little bit shocking. And I thought, have we been robbed? And I thought, no, I know what's happened. My roommates and I played jokes on each other. We kept putting each other's stuff out on the balcony. And I thought, well, you know what? Joke's on them. Because now I'm going to have to tromp through the room wet without a towel to get my stuff off the balcony. So, that's inconvenient for everyone. So I did, hopped out of the shower, scurried across the room, out to the balcony, and none of my stuff was there. The crisis continued. I worried for a second, and then I heard the door to the room open, and I thought, okay, my roommates are home. They're gonna have a laugh. I'm out on the balcony naked. Where's my stuff? And instead, 3 people I've never seen before in my life came into the room. Obviously, because it wasn't my room, it was theirs, but I didn't know this. I was still in the midst of crisis. This happens a lot in change as well. In transitions, sometimes we don't even know what the crisis we're dealing with is. We just know that we feel vastly unprepared. This is important as far as the steps go because it starts with adventure in the unknown. We get to a point of crisis. And the hardest part sometimes about change and transition is we get stuck there and think that maybe this is all there is. It's not. As I stood on the balcony, in my example of how to deal with this, I realized these people were unknown to me. And my initial conclusion was, we must be being robbed. So I thought, I will leap in and save the day. I'll wait till they start rummaging through things and then leap in from the balcony and catch them red-handed. I would be a hero, a naked hero, but still a hero. I don't know if that's an upgrade. But they seemed really calm. They just sort of sat on the bed and chatted. And I looked out over the balcony and thought, how weird is my life? I'm on this retreat, I'm naked on a balcony, these people are robbing us calmly. And as I looked to the ground, I thought, wow, the plants grow really quick here. And then I realized they don't grow that quick. They're bigger because I'm closer to them. I counted the balconies, and here's where the crisis came into horrific relief. I realized I was in the wrong room. Crisis had come full head. I needed to move to the next stage of transition, which is recovery. So I began to think about, what do I do about this? And I thought, all right, I could climb down and probably make it to my room. No. Then I would have to climb down and be naked on the ground floor and climb up 5 flights. No, that's not going to work. I could probably climb up, but if I fall to my death, hard to explain. The only thing to do was to go in. And I waited for far too long. I thought I could just enter calmly, but I panicked so much that I went in with a lot of pent-up panic. I threw the door open and I flung myself in, and then I said nothing. These poor 3 guys in the room were caught completely off guard. They turned to face me and said nothing. I stood there, al naturel, and said nothing. I wasn't in recovery yet. I was still in crisis. I didn't know what to do. So I just left, just walked calmly out the room, out the door, and then stopped and thought, well, this was dumb. Now I'm in the hallway naked. And besides, my clothes are all still on the floor in the bathroom. I have to get them. So I waited maybe 10 seconds. And then this time I calmly opened the door and walked back in and got my stuff. The 3 guys hadn't moved at all. They were so stunned and shocked. I grabbed my things. I made it to my room. My roommates wondered why I had taken so long, and I didn't bother explaining to them. This camp ended and everything was fine. In those few moments, though, that crisis was horrifying. I was 15. This was one of the most embarrassing things I'd ever done. And a whole year later, I learned what adjustment was. A whole year later, I had moved to a completely different place, and I went to visit a friend of mine who'd been on that trip. Her name was Crystal. Crystal and I were talking about all the fun memories, and she stops me and says, I have to tell you about the funniest thing. I said, okay. She said, listen, I met these guys here where I live now. You'll never guess what happened to them. They're in their room hanging out right, and this guy comes in from the balcony, stark naked, flashes them, runs out the room, comes back in, flashes them again. How weird is that? Here's where I finally realized I had reached the final stage of transition, adjustment, because I was able to admit to Crystal. I said, Crystal, that was me. And she said, no. I said, yes. And explained to her the whole thing from my perspective. I actually even got to meet them. They went to her youth group. It was very exciting meeting these poor 3 guys. The look of shock on their face when they saw me again. I mean, it's a little different because I had clothes on. But still, I adjusted. It became part of my story. This is a funny incident. You can look at Bible stories of Abraham and hear more serious incidents. But I think having some sort of structure to apply to change is really helpful. Realizing that in general, we move through a cycle in change and transition, going from adventure to crisis to recovery to adjustment. That cycle keeps repeating. That cycle moves faster and slower for different people. Sometimes it's a big crisis, sometimes a little crisis, but it starts with adventure in the unknown. All change does. We always hit a point where we feel unprepared, crisis big or small. We do recover from it. We do manage to make it through. We survive the crisis. And then we adjust. It becomes part of our story. That's a beautiful thing because our story can help other people. I want to close with another verse. It's a very well-known verse. It's Jeremiah 29:11. And it says this, For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. It's a really encouraging verse, but it's actually in a much wider context that I think is really important and may actually help us now as we deal with all the changes that have come at us because of the pandemic. And there are more changes to come. I think this verse actually provides more comfort than we realize. You see, this was written by the prophet Jeremiah, and it was actually spoken to a nation dealing with a ton of hardship. Many of us are dealing with hardship. He was speaking to the Jewish people who had been subjugated by their enemies, then evicted from their homeland. So at this point where he's speaking to them, they're refugees, they're migrants, they're tired of living under hostile rule, they're outside of their homeland, they're having an incredibly rough time. In some ways, there are relatable elements to this. We've been shoved out of what we consider to be normal. Some people in the world are dealing with the actual struggle of being refugees and migrants in the midst of a pandemic. There are different levels of change we're all dealing with. But this verse is spoken by Jeremiah to a Jewish people dealing with all of that. And for even more context, in the chapter before this, we learn about a false prophet whose name was Hananiah, who falsely told the Jewish people in the midst of all of this, she told them what they wanted to hear. And Hananiah said, listen, in just 2 years, this is all going to be fine, and we're all going to be saved. God will crush the Babylonians, and everything will be good. And it was Jeremiah's job to tell people the truth that they didn't want to hear. And so he said, no, actually, this is going to go on for a while. So you may as well settle in, deal with the change, confront everything we're going through, and move on. We can't just pause. We can't just hold up. We're actually going to be here a while. And that's where he speaks those very, very comforting words to a nation who's dealing with a load of struggle. He says that God isn't going to abandon them. He says that we have to deal with the change. The verse is not a promise that everything will be fine on the schedule that we want it to. It's a promise that God has bigger plans and doesn't forget us in those plans. Dealing with change and transition, it's a life skill that we all need. Some changes are slow and gradual, some are fast and shocking, but I genuinely believe most of them follow some degree of this plan. They start with adventure. There's always an element of crisis that follows that. We do recover from it, and then we adjust, and it's part of our stories. Many of the stories that I tell weren't necessarily fun at the time. When I was 15, if you had told me that this incredibly embarrassing moment where I just wanted to be anywhere but there, this was horrific to go through, that someday I would be able to laugh about it and actually use it to hopefully help other people, I don't think I would have believed you. The same is true for many of us. We have to embrace change. We have to know that even in the darkest parts of crisis, there are other stages. We're not going to be left there forever. I want to read to you Jeremiah 29:11 again, knowing that it comes in the midst of difficulties for an entire nation, knowing that it's telling people that they're going to have to deal with change, that they're not actually going to get out of it as quick as they can. The same, I think, is true for us. God says to us here and now, knowing the difficulties we're in, that for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Whatever stage of change you feel like you're in, it's going to move on. We will adjust. This will be part of our story, and our stories fit together. Our stories move forward. God has a much bigger story for all of us. Thanks so much for tuning in. I do hope that this finds you well.